The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
Hello and welcome to Voices from L5, the podcast all about the other side of space settlement. Today with me is Al Globus, one of the top NSS board members, who's here to talk about the types of space settlement that exist and some exciting new research that he's been involved in regarding space settlement. Hey Al, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's great to have you on the show. You're definitely one of the big names in space settlement, and it's just fantastic to have you on here.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really looking forward to some of the interesting things we're going to get into today. So some people, when they talk about space settlement, when I talk to them about it, and I'm sure when you've talked to them about it, you start talking about humans living in space, and the very first thing they reply with is, well, it'd be cool to live on Mars. And, with all these movies out about people living on Mars and going to Mars right now, and all the stuff that NASA's talking about going to Mars and that sort of thing, the old NSS, Island 3 style settlements have fallen a little bit by the wayside, at least in the public eye right now. So I thought it would be good to have an episode where we talk a little bit about all these various different kinds of space settlement, and about where humanity can advance a little bit.
So there are two fundamental flavors of space settlements. There are surface space settlements, for instance on Mars or on the moon, or perhaps some other moon or Mercury or wherever. And then there are free space settlements, which are in orbit, either around the sun or around Earth or wherever that orbit happens to be. Mm-hmm. And I am a fan, an advocate of free space settlements. However, as you mentioned, in popular culture, surface settlements, radically dominate.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is pretty obvious why that would be. I mean, people are very used to the idea of humans being on Earth, and I think when people think about living somewhere else, they just immediately think things are going to be very similar to how they are here. I mean, it's the only way that humanity's ever lived. So, that's the obvious extrapolation.
Yeah, George O'Neill used to call it planetary chauvinism. Mm-hmm. And it's completely understandable because that's what we're accustomed to doing. And I'm sure that people will eventually live on the moon and Mars. I think it'll be a little while. And I think there are much easier places to get started, but I think they'll get there eventually.
Sure.
The reason that I think that there will be free space settlements first is that they're considerably easier. And now that didn't used to be true, but there's some new research that says it is true. Basically, the moon and Mars, which are the big targets for space settlement, they're very far away. Mm-hmm. Compared to the type of settlements that I'm going to talk about, which are really in low Earth orbit. And I'll explain why that works in not too long. Mm-hmm. The moon is 760 times further away. And Mars, at closest approach, is 100,000 times further away. It's more difficult to do things that are far away than close. That's why we have had space stations orbit since the 1970s. We've got one up there right now, and there's 6 or 8 or 9 people on board. Mm-hmm. Okay? But there are no space stations on the moon, and there are no space stations on Mars. And the reason is not because we wouldn't like to have space stations there. It's because it's much, much more difficult, much, much more expensive, and so it hasn't happened. And that's true of settlement as well. If you do things close, it's easier. There's a bunch of little things, but there's also one big problem with Moon and Mars for early space settlement. I'm talking about the first few generations.
Sure.
And that is the gravity level. Now, my definition of a space settlement, my personal definition of space settlement, is a place where people go to live and work and raise their children. Right? And it's that third one that really differentiates space settlement from a space station or a space hotel.
Right.
You don't go to the International Space Station to have a kid and raise him up and send him to kindergarten, right? But that's to me what determines a settlement. Now, if you are raising children in a free space settlement, typical designs, you rotate the settlement at a speed such that in the living areas you get 1 g of pseudo-gravity, artificial gravity, and your kids will grow up, reasonably expect them to grow up strong with bones and muscles comparable to bones and muscles on somebody on Earth, because the artificial gravity will stress your bones and muscles to do that. If you grow up on the moon or Mars, you will be exposed to much lower gravity levels. I think 3/8 of 1 g, and on the moon it's about 1/6. There's a couple of things about that. First of all, we really do not know what will happen to kids, or adults for that matter, long term in reduced gravity levels.
Or even embryos, really, like to take that even further.
A liquid environment, so they're kind of weightless anyway, so they'll probably be okay. And that's quite testable. You know, you can test that with rodents or something. You have to have a base on the moon or Mars to do, but we do know that minus the stress of living in a 1 g environment, those kids are going to grow up with much weaker bones and muscles than the kids on Earth.
Right.
And to go visit Earth, if you get a kid that's a great scholar and they want to go to Harvard or MIT, that's probably not going to work. And one thing I can tell you with absolute certainty, if you've got a kid that's a great violinist, they will not be able to take a quick trip to Carnegie Hall to play to play a recital, because they won't be able to stand up. Okay?
Right.
They'll have a really tough time holding up their violin. I mean, you can sort of imagine that if you went to college, you could go through this incredible exercise program and maybe you could just barely pull it off. But short trips are out of the question.
Right.
And to me, now people have different opinions. I view doing that to children as like kind of it's not a good thing.
Right.
But you shouldn't do that to kids. Okay, that's wrong. Not until you've had a chance to build up to it and have lots of research over many time, which free space settlements give you an opportunity to do. Okay. The other thing, the other major advantage I see for free space settlements is in the very, very long term. When the time comes to go to the nearest star, being settled on Mars and the moon is not really going to help you very much. Okay. But if you've been living in free space settlements for 50 generations or 500 generations, whether you happen to be going around the sun or on your way to Alpha Centauri, it doesn't matter that much.
Right.
You follow your friends and family. Presumably by this time these things are pretty large, and you might go in groups. And when you get to Alpha Centauri or Alpha Proxima or wherever you're going to, you don't need a habitable planet. You just need some asteroids and junk, which brings up another issue. The total land area you can get from free space settlements, if you assume that you use up most of the asteroid belt, is hundreds of times greater than the amount of land that you get from the moon and Mars. So your total ability to expand in the very long term is much greater. Your kids will be in better shape in the short term, and it's easier. So those are the basic three things. Now, it wasn't necessarily easier until very recently. The free space settlements, I mean, this podcast has got L5 in the name. That's because the original free space settlement designs were placed at L5, which is a point that is equidistant from the moon and Earth in the moon's orbit, which is a stable point. When you put something there, it'll stay there.
Right.
To a first approximation. And if you put a settlement at L5, you need a lot of radiation shielding. Turns out you need about 6 or 7 tons of polyethylene or water, or about 10 or 11 tons of lunar regolith per square meter. Yes. And so if I have numbers for this, if you look at Kalpana 1, which is a space settlement that rotates at 2 RPM, a design, it would weigh, if you put it at L5, about 4.3 million tons. Mostly radiation shielding. And the idea behind the early studies that came up with L5 would put a mine on the moon, and then you'd have an electromagnetic catapult that would throw the materials to a catcher at L2, which would fill up and then take the materials to L5, where they would be processed and turned into hulls and used in their raw form as radiation shielding and so forth and so on. So there's this big, enormous mining operation and transport operation that was going to move millions of tons off of the moon and into L5, and then there was going to be this, build these enormous structures that typically would rotate at 1 or 2 RPM. So the speed at which you rotate determines the size of the system if you want 1G, so your kids will grow up with bones and muscles and stuff like that. So the systems were very big because they rotated slowly at 1 or 2 RPM. Now, if you compare that system to building a settlement on the moon or Mars, it's not at all clear which is more difficult. It may be that the moon is easier. It's hard to say that Mars would be easier since it's so far away.
Right.
But it turns out that the reason that those settlements were put at L5 is because in space there's a lot of radiation, and they needed some source of radiation shielding. Okay, so you put it close to the moon, which is a great source of, not a great source of radiation shielding, but it's pretty good.
About as good as you're going to get up there.
Right. But what if you didn't need that radiation shielding? What in a place in space where there wasn't a whole lot of radiation, so that you wouldn't need any or very little dedicated radiation shielding? What if the hull and the furnishings and so forth gave you enough protection?
Now you're bringing us to this new research that you've been involved in here, I think.
Exactly. It turns out that there is a place like that. And if you look at a map of radiation, in the papers and stuff, this map is in there, measured by the International Space Station, you'll see that most of the radiation that the astronauts are exposed to in the ISS is in the South Atlantic. There's something called the South Atlantic anomaly, where radiation levels are much, much higher than over the rest of the globe. Now, the International Space Station is at a 51-degree orbit, so it passes over all of the Earth between 51 degrees positive and 51 degrees negative around the equator. So it passes through the South Atlantic anomaly. But if you're in orbit around the equator, you don't pass through the Atlantic anomaly, and radiations are much, much lower. So if you look at this map that's in the papers and stuff, you'll see this. In addition, collaborator Joe Strout and I have done a whole bunch of calculations of radiation damage. And this is a wonderful thing. NASA they have very sophisticated radiation codes, which will, given a radiation environment, it knows about the radiation environment in space, and it knows about its effect on biological tissue, and it knows about what shielding does, and so forth and so on. There's a web front end to these called Ulteris. And anybody who can do algebra and knows a little bit about web applications and a little bit about radiation can figure out how to use this, and it's free to all American citizens and I presume green card holders. I don't really know. So in any case, Joe Strout and I used this to calculate the amount of radiation shielding necessary if you were at L5. And one of the discoveries we made was that water and polyethylene are much better than lunar regolith.
Right.
So that might mean maybe that asteroids would be a slightly better source of material. But the much more exciting study, and that's great, much more exciting study is on kind of a whim. I did the calculations, the same calculations we were doing for deep space, or L5, in a equatorial low Earth orbit. I started at 600 kilometers. And I'm looking at 1 ton of shielding per square meter, 2 tons of shielding per square meter, and so forth and so on. And I looked on, and the radiation levels were very low. I mean, with even 1 ton of shielding, there was plenty of shielding so that there should be no problem at all. Now, I should step back that we had to come up with a threshold so we knew what was no problem, but we'll get back to that.
Right.
So Eddie goes, oh, this is really interesting. Let's look at less shielding. So I looked at all the way from zero shielding, actually a little hack because Ulteris can't do zero shielding. I did a millionth of a gram of lunar regolith per square meter. So basically,
that should be fine.
All the way through about 2 tons. And here's the beautiful thing about it. For the adult threshold for radiation, no radiation shielding at all meets the... Yeah.
That's some incredible stuff.
And it slightly exceeds that, no radiation shielding, but just tens of polyethylene to meet our women criteria. And the hull is likely to give you at least that. If not, you can add some water or some polyethylene. So this is very exciting. And so that was like one part. That all of a sudden there's this look that's very close to Earth, I mean, you really can't get any closer than and still be in space. Since then, I started focusing on 500 kilometers because 600 kilometers does have, it's a little bit of, you do need a little shielding at 600 kilometers, but at 500 kilometers, you don't really need any shielding at all, just a tiny bit. So that's been the focus. But really, there's a trade space between 400 and 600 or 700 kilometers, and you work that out.
Right. That's interesting. It does raise a couple questions. I mean, obviously, first thing, let's go with what are these thresholds that you're talking about?
Okay. So there's two thresholds, one for adults and one for pregnant women, because the fetus and the embryo are more susceptible. Now, the threshold we chose for the adults is 20 millisieverts per year. And a millisievert is a measure of the biological effectiveness of radiation. So it varies with the kind of radiation, and it varies with the kind of tissue. And the place where we did our measurement, our computational measurement, not a real measurement, computational measurement, was female ovaries, because there is some indication in the literature that that is the most susceptible adult tissue. Okay? And so we looked, if you look at the U.S. average background radiation, not counting dental x-rays and stuff like that, you get about 3.1 millisieverts per year, which is a lot less than 20.
Right.
But it's an average. There are places in the U.S. where it's much higher. There are places where it's much lower. Now, I couldn't find any data on the U.S. distribution, but I did find data on European distribution. And there are large parts of Europe, in Finland and Spain, and smaller parts elsewhere, where the normal background radiation is in excess of 10 millisieverts per year, which is only a factor of 2 lower than our adult threshold.
Right.
Furthermore, there are parts of Iran, Brazil, and China where the radiation levels are much, much higher than 20 millisieverts a year. And people have lived there for thousands of years with apparently no ill effect.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Are those areas related to any sort of higher instances of cancer or anything?
Not as, I mean, they may be, but nobody has found it. Now, there probably is a little higher rate of cancer. I wouldn't be surprised. So also, finally, the things that sort of nailed it down at 20, why not 19? Why not 30? Why not 15? The International Commission on Radio Protection, national organization, with a whole bunch of folks who do a lot of great work in terms of understanding radiation effects on biosystems and ameliorate it. Okay, and their occupational threshold recommendation for radiation workers, like nuclear power plant workers, is 20 millisieverts a year.
Right.
Furthermore, I have one reference. I've never been able to find a second reference that the Japanese government's threshold for allowing people back to their homes after the Fukushima disaster is also 20 millisieverts per year.
Right. So there's some indication somewhere that this is agreed upon.
This is possible.
Yeah.
Now, maybe it'll turn out that this number needs to be changed. But it seems reasonably solid for now. By the way, the astronaut limit is 500 millisieverts per year with a 10 to 30K lifetime. Now, at 20 millisieverts a year, you'll never get to 10,000 millisieverts. Not unless, you go. The other thing to remember about threshold, about for adults, it's going to be higher radiation. If you move from California to Chicago, the radiation environment is going to change. Okay, and if you move to those parts of Spain and Finland I was talking about, it's going to go up quite a bit. But the thing is that the other risks of living into space probably swamp the risk associated with cancer a little more often.
Right.
The other thing is, we're not going to build these things for decades. It's going to take a long time to be ready to start building these. And in that time, cancer research, for example, is going to progress, and so is treatment. So although the radioisolation has a number of different negatives, not cataracts and so forth, but it is completely reasonable to assume that in the period between now and when we actually build one of these things, that medical science will advance and that the damage associated with radiation will be much more treatable than it is today.
Especially if you consider that medical science will have an impetus to build upon those things with a settlement being built.
Right. Well, also they have a tremendous, there's tremendous incentive due to the people exposed to radiation on the ground, exposed to different kinds of radiation. And by the way, that's an important caveat. All these things we're talking about, the data behind those recommendations, it all comes from different kinds of radiation than we're really worried about in space.
Right.
So there is a converting from the radiation to the biological, different kinds of radiation on different kinds of tissue, but the data behind that is not long. However, the data behind the most dangerous kind of radiation in space is galactic cosmic rays,
right,
which come from all directions and at all energies and at all sizes. But the ones that we're most concerned with are the heavy ones, like iron, that are moving at relativistic speeds, because the smaller, lighter, slower ones get deflected by the Earth's magnetic field if you're in equatorial Leo, in E Leo.
Right.
So there's very little data on human exposure to galactic cosmic rays.
Right.
And it's not something, and there's not even the greatest studies for animals, because you can put, and they do put, and my sister actually does this, put rodents in an accelerator. Brookhaven is used for this purpose, and you can irradiate those animals with relativistic iron nuclide, just exactly the sort of thing we're worried about, a controlled environment, and you can study what happens. But you can't do it for weeks or months. Like if you wanted to study rodent gestation under this bombardment, rodent gestation takes 20 days, 21 days, something like that.
Right. You can't very well put them in an accelerator for 20 days. You can't leave them
in an accelerator for 21 days. For one thing, this at Brookhaven costs $7,000 an hour.
Huh.
Okay? And I'm pretty sure that doesn't count overtime for this midnight to AM shift.
Right.
To 8 shift, right? So, and it gets worse. The level of GCR in space is very, very low. There's not a lot of it. And Brookhaven doesn't even list what their lowest amount is. Okay? So it's not clear exactly what. The other thing is that at Brookhaven, the radiation is delivered in what's called spills. And a spill is about 4 seconds. And there's a certain amount per spill. I don't know where the word spill came from. But within a spill, only about 10% of that time is there actually any radiation. The rest of the time it's off. Huh. So what does this mean? Is even if you could keep your rodents in there for 21 days, the radiation they would be getting is 10 times more intense than the radiation they've been shown in space. And since nobody actually runs a 21-day study, they really go in and maybe have 1 or 2 doses. What they do is they say how much dosage are they going to get on a whole trip to Mars, because everybody wants to go to Mars, and then they give them all of that radiation at once, and they look at the effects. Well,
that's not very realistic, though.
No,
yeah,
it's not. I mean, it's the best they can do. They're doing good science.
Of course.
These are doing good work. But don't fool yourself into thinking that this is necessarily a great model for what you're really going to get. So to tell the truth, I mean, to do the settlements that I'm advocating, 500 kilometers, small, predicted by radiation, before we do that, we need a space station in that same orbit so that we can really look. And we need that station to either have plenty of centrifuges or rotate so that we can really look at the effects of that level of radiation on biological tissue and rodents and, salamanders and fruit flies and tissue samples and so forth and so on. So we really understand this. And that's a doable thing. It's a little bit on the expensive side.
Right, of course. And the second issue that arises to my mind here with these sorts of settlements, one of the great benefits I always felt of space settlement and not planetary settlement, and free space settlement as you call it, was that the problem of space, as in living space, isn't so much of an issue anymore, in that one settlement being built is not going to realistically impact upon another settlement's airspace, I suppose, space, significantly, because the areas that you're talking about are so huge and these settlements are so relatively minuscule compared to the overall area that you're talking about. Now, when you're talking about LEO, low Earth orbit, would there not be a risk of sort of the issue that we're seeing now with satellites, where things would get pretty busy up there pretty quickly?
Yeah. Oh, Leo will fill up. And how fast it fills up depends on how far you need to space your settlements in a given orbit and how many different altitudes you can use. Because the higher your altitude, the more radiation you get.
Right.
The lower your altitude, the sooner you will deorbit if something goes wrong. Right? So there is a limit to how many settlements you can put in ELEO. But here's the interesting thing. The key to breaking out of ELEO is to be able to do the same thing that Gerard O'Neill was talking about, to access extraterrestrial materials. Let's say lunar for now. Okay? So in order to get out of to expand beyond ELEO, beyond that first 40 or 100 or 200 settlements, which is probably close to what the limit is, we need a source of materials for radiation shielding. Well, the problem, if you look at the various schemes for mining the moon and the asteroids, they all suffer from the same horrendous problem. There's not much of a market.
Right.
Okay? You can't really compete with the markets on Earth because of the transportation costs. So your market is what's in space. So what's in space now? Well, there's 6 people on the ISS. Maybe it's 9 right now, but it's normally 6. Okay? And there's about 1,300 satellites, none of which, except the Hubble was designed to be repaired, but none of which are designed to have parts replaced, and none of which are designed to be refueled. That's a crummy little market,
Right.
right? And the only, it's gonna, like if NASA starts going to Mars, yeah, you might want to put fuel depots of lunar oxygen and but it's still a little teeny itsy bitsy market. Okay. If you had 40 or 50 or 100 space settlements, and eventually we're going to start making little ones, but eventually 1,000 people a piece, we're starting to talk on the order of millions of people. Now you've got a market for your lunar materials.
Right.
Now you have a market incentive to build lunar mines. And once you've built lunar mines, then is high altitude settlements, because they need millions of tons of mass per space settlement. Then it's a huge market. So that's how you break out of Leo, and you get into high Earth orbit, maybe even L5 and L4. I don't know. It's a thing. And then once the step beyond that, once you've got, thousands of settlements in these very high orbits, then you might start thinking about building the next settlement co-orbiting with an asteroid and use that asteroid for materials. Right. Then you're off to the races. Then once you know how to do that, you can make enormous amounts of space settlements, including Phobos and Deimos. So use those materials, which you can use as a base for colonizing Mars. So instead of colonizing Mars with this heroic, Hail Mary pass, tens of millions of miles away, and somehow you're going to survive with, getting shipments from Earth every 18 months or 2 years. Instead, you've got a whole industrial infrastructure in space that can get you down onto that surface. And that's the model that I prefer.
I mean, yeah, you're talking a lot more realistic than a lot of these pie-in-the-sky ideas of shooting straight for the end goal at once. You're talking about building up an eventual, steps all the way toward, ultimate settlement of wherever it is you want to go. And I think that really does hit on a lot of points that are lacking in a lot of other folks' dreams of space settlement, where we just leap straight to this, amazing thing right away, like within 15 years we're settling Mars and all the moons of the solar system. And I think that a lot of this that you're talking about makes a great deal of sense. The idea of settling LEO first makes just visceral sense before you even start talking about the nitty gritty of it, like we did. I mean, when you summed it up earlier really well by just saying things that are closer are easier. When you're talking about settlement, that's utterly true. There's a reason we didn't immediately go from the rivers of Africa to settling the Antarctica. That just wouldn't really work out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, until you realize that you don't need radiation shielding or much,
Right.
LEO doesn't work because you'd have to launch millions of tons of material.
Right.
But it turns out that this is the case. Okay. Now there's another piece, and that is, these settlements. The early designs rotate at 1 or 2 RPM, and that means they're big. Okay. At 2 RPM, you have to have a radius of about a diameter of about 450 meters. That's a very big system to build.
Right.
And now it turns out, Theodore Hall and I went through. Theodore Hall is a recognized expert on rotation sickness. As we went through the literature and said, well, how fast can you rotate? How fast can you really rotate? And it turns out the literature is pretty clear. Rotation rates at up to 4 RPM really should not be very much of a problem for settlers or even for visitors. You might be a little ill for a day or two as a visitor, or more likely for a few hours, but if you're particularly a day or two, but you'll get over it. And you might even be able to go to 6 RPM, but then your visitors are going to get kind of sick. Nobody's going to want to visit for a weekend because they're just going to be sick the whole time.
Right.
But they're just going to come for a week. But the point is, instead of building, the 4 RPM settlement has 112 meters in diameter, as opposed to 2 RPM, which is 400 meters diameter. And the mass scales with at least the square, and in some cases the cube of the radius. It's inverse, so you get a huge reduction. Now, if you take that mass reduction and you put it together with the mass reduction of not needing any radiation shielding, you get a factor of hundreds. The mass that you need in order to build a 4 RPM settlement in ELEO is hundreds of times less than putting Kalpana 1 and L5. And we've calculated with 2 different mass models, one by Stephen Covey, and he comes up with a difference of 480. The factor is 480. Now remember, these are rough models, and there's a lot of assumptions, okay? Joe Strout, he's got this great game called The High Frontier, which I encourage everybody to go play. It's on the web. We get a reduction going from 2 to 4 RPM and getting rid of the shielding of 290, okay? Now, neither of those numbers is right. But what it tells us, and we can also do analysis, it tells us that the reduction in mass when you go to 4 RPM instead of 2 RPM and you get rid of the radiation shielding is on the factor of hundreds.
Right.
And that's why space settlement in ELEO works. It's because the mass is so much less than we thought it was.
Even if you're talking about a reduction of only 100, you're still talking about a game changer there.
Absolutely, total game changer. In fact, the estimated mass of a cylindrical settlement at 4 RPM, 112 meters diameter, is about 9 kilotons. Well, the International Space Station is only 400 tons. That's 0.4 kilotons. Okay, so we're talking, let's see, 2 times 9 is 8. 20 times the mass of the International Space Station.
Right.
Well, that's a lot, but it's not ridiculous.
Right. It's not unbelievable.
Yeah, and if you look at the Falcon Heavy, if SpaceX is able to do what they say they're going to do, and they've done a lot of that, so they have some credibility. Falcon Heavy is supposed to launch 53 tons to LEO, so call it 50 for ease of calculation, and we're talking about 20 launches per kiloton, and we're talking about 9 kilotons, so that's 180 Falcon Heavy launches to get all the materials up there. Well, that's a lot.
Right.
Okay. But it's not ridiculous. One can imagine launching, Falcon 9 a couple hundred times. And that works. Now here's something, we talked about incremental. We for the first settlement, we don't want to go to L5 or we don't want to go to Mars or the Moon. They're too far away. And in L5 case, they're too massive. Because remember, on the Moon and Mars, you can pile up local soil or regolith and get decent radiation shielding. You need, it's a bunch of work, but it's certainly doable.
Right.
The rest of the mass of the system is probably about the same, whether you're on a surface or in deep space. But it's still a big jump from where we are now to 180, Falcon Heavy launches and building a 100-meter cylinder. I mean, yes, the International Space Station is about the same length, it's about 100 meters, but it's not a cylinder. It's basically a line.
Right, it's a tube.
So there's actually another step back you can take.
Right.
And what you can say is, look, at the International Space Station is there today, and it is tourists. And one guy went there twice. Okay. And Bigelow Aerospace is building a space station, the B 330, which they plan to launch. And they didn't used to market to tourists, but they do now. It's on their website. Okay. So it turns out that the tourist business the space tour is very sensitive to price. As the price goes down, the number of people goes up, and it goes up a lot.
Right.
So if Bigelow can be profitable in his space station, flying tourists, that will be an incentive for more people to jump in. As more people jump in, you get economies of scale, and the prices reduce.
Right.
And you get, this is the hope, a virtuous cycle where you get larger and larger hotels demanding more and more transport from Earth. Both the hotel prices and the transport prices drop over time because they have this mutual interaction until you get to the point where you build a 9 kiloton system for a price that 500 people could afford. 500 people is about the size, the number of people that would be, according to our assumptions.
Yeah.
There'll be a population. Okay. Now, all these things are very rough, but the real key is to get onto that virtuous cycle.
Right.
The real key is to get in a situation where the more tourists go, the cheaper the price, the more tourists go, and it just revolves around and around, driving the price down. And I have no idea how long or difficult that would take, but it is an incremental path from where we are right now to the first space settlement, and it is not a ridiculous thing to do, although it will probably take a few decades at least.
Right. What leaps out to me is the potential benefits for other paths of space, let's call it exploitation, that some of this research leads to. Like, one of the things that I'm super excited about and a big proponent of is space-based solar power. And this revelation that the shielding isn't as big of a deal at the equator could have massive ramifications for that sort of business. I mean, one of the things holding back space solar is, again, the difficulty of putting enough stuff up there, both to build it and protect the people building it and maintaining, a space solar plant. And, some of these revelations immediately bring the costs of that down massively.
Well, the main thing is, the radiation levels at geosync, which is where most designs for space solar power go, the Earth's magnetic field doesn't help you much there. So you're going to get the same, but radiation it's an engineering problem, but it's not is at L5 or on the surface of Mars, so the radiation levels are very high, and because you're not necessarily going to have people there,
right? At least not 24/7.
Yeah, and so particularly now, the real benefit that solar power gets out of this approach is the launch cost.
Right.
Base solar power is completely non-terrestrial sources at current launch costs. Mm-hmm. And you can argue about how far it has to come down, but it has to come down a great deal.
Right.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you'll notice that I put my trust in tourism, or my hope in tourism is a better way to put it, to reduce the cost of launch, not space solar power. And the reason for that is very simple. There is a market at $20 or $30 or $40 million a person to be a tourist in space because people have paid that to go.
Right.
That market exists. There is so you can get this incremental thing going on. With space solar power, it's kind of all or nothing. Mm-hmm. If you're using microwaves for transmission, you need kilometer scale antennas on both ends. Mm. So you have this enormous system you have to build on space, and even bigger system you have to build on Earth. And you have to get this whole thing up and working before you can deliver 1 watt to a customer and get some revenue. Mm-hmm. Okay, actually you can deliver very, very small amounts of power, but not enough to make it really any difference. And in addition, you've got really tough terrestrial competition. Okay, so I think space solar power is going to have to drive the technical improvements that we need. We need a lot of them because it has this sort of all or nothing capacity. There's no easy way to build up to it. Actually, the easy way to build up to it is to use beamed power in space. Mm-hmm. Okay, but I don't want to address that right now. It's a great thing. It's a really good thing. People should do it. Gary Barnhart's doing some terrific work in that area with the International Space Station. But the thing is, it can benefit from this, but I don't think the space solar power is going to be able to drive the launcher technology until it gets to the point where you're actually selling juice to paying customers, which is it's going to be a long time. Whereas tourists are actually paying for rides now, and if anybody could give them a seat, a lot of people would like to go.
Right.
There's 700 people that put down a deposit and not bailed after to fly on Spaceship Two. That's after the accident.
Right.
But we know there are people who want to fly on the Russian station, trying to fly with the Russians, but $50 million a pop seems to have been too much. People are bailing on that, and they end up flying a Kazakh astronaut. But the customers are there. We just don't have the technology to provide the seats.
Right. I would love to have an entire show of you and I debating the settlement versus tourism versus solar power and various different other catalysts. I think that would be a fantastic show.
That'd be great fun. Let's do it. But
let's
do it today.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that pretty much is bringing us to the end of this episode, though. Is there anything else you wanted to throw out there before we get going?
The main thing is that this is all very preliminary. Mm-hmm. There's some things that are pretty solid, like the radiation calculations. Those are pretty good, and the adult thresholds. Mm-hmm. And also the rotation tolerance is very solid. There's something that's not so solid, such as the radiation tolerance of pregnant women. That we think we have a good number, but we're not really sure. The numbers on the cost to get into space and launch costs, those are pretty soft too. Those are just advertised things. Oh, there is one thing. In order to make this work as a real estate business, to sell houses on space settlements in the range of maybe $1 million or a few $1 million, you need to reduce the cost of launch by a factor of 50.
It's a little bit.
That's a lot.
It's a couple bucks.
The thing is, if you want to settle anywhere else, it's more. Because ELEO is as close as you can get.
Right.
And you don't need radiation shielding, so you have no mass disadvantage settlements on the Moon or Mars.
Right. Okay, well, this has been a lot of interesting stuff. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this research goes and how it's going to mature and what stuff we can really learn from this. Definitely seems like a game changer for the whole settlement game, though.
I hope so.
You've been fantastic, Al. It's been nice having you on the show. Thanks for finally joining us.
It was my pleasure, and I hope to do it many times in the future.
I look forward to it. Bye now.
Take care of yourself.
If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com or leave a comment. Music for Voices from L5 has been graciously provided by John Boswell of Symphony of Science. Find more of his work at www.symphonyofscience.com. Hey, if you like what we do here and you want to hear more experts from all sorts of fields talking about space settlement in ways that you might not hear anywhere else, consider donating to our Patreon account. We really rely on donations to keep the show going, and even a small donation helps us get better guests, better equipment, and produce a better show for you. We have some great goals in mind for the show, and we'd really like you to make something special. You can check out a link to our Patreon account on the website, or in the comments, all links that accompany this show. Thanks.